In today's video, I'm going to show you how to deploy a MERN application to a VPS with Docker. I built this app in a previous video, and I'll be using it as an example today. I'll show you how to SSH into a remote server, run your application, set up a firewall, configure DNS, and hook up a real domain to your app. I'll be using a DigitalOcean Droplet as my VPS, so you'll need to create an account here if you want to follow along. I also have a referral link in the description below that'll give you some free credit when you sign up, so it shouldn't cost you anything to follow along. Without further ado, let's get started. So I have the codebase open, and I'll leave it in the description below if you want to pull it down and follow along. Just make sure that you check out the YT Docker prod branch on the repo. I'm constantly updating the main branch, and so it could get out of sync with what you see in this video, but this branch will be locked down to the version you see right now. I'm not going to go over how I set this up with Docker. I did that in a previous video, which I will also link in the description below, where I go in depth on how I set up each of these services. In this video, though, I'm just going to be focused on deploying this setup and getting it out there live on the internet. Essentially, all we need to do is create a VPS, which is just a remote server out there in the world. Then we need to SSH into it, clone this repository, and then just run one command, docker compose up, and that's going to spin up all of these services and run our application. So you'll see that in a second. Before I set up the VPS, I want to go into Resend and set up a custom domain that I can send emails from. To do that, go to your Resend dashboard, and under the Domains tab, let's add a domain. You want to add your custom domain, and then select a region. Now we need to add some DNS records in our domain registrar so that Resend can verify that we actually own this domain name. After we add these records and they're able to verify the domain name, we could send emails from a custom email using this domain, like noreply@thisdomain.com. Now let's add these records. So I'm going to be using Cloudflare as my DNS provider, but it's going to work very similar with all other providers. So I'm going to split this tab on the right half, and then I'll have my Cloudflare tab on the left half. In here, I have my DNS records, and currently I have no records in there. So I'm going to add a new record, and Resend is telling me to add an MX record, and we'll set the host to send. So in the type here, I'll add an MX. I'll set the name to send, and then I'll copy this value. The TTL can be left at auto, and we'll give it the priority of 10. So let's save that record. Then let's add the next record, which is a TXT record. For the name, it also is send. Then let's copy the value here and paste it in for the content. Now let's add this third record here, which is another TXT record. And I'll paste in the name. And lastly, let's grab the value. Then there's this optional record that we can add for increased security. And so I'm just going to add that one, which is also a TXT record. I'll paste in the name and then copy the value over. So once you've added all of these records, it's going to take a few minutes for DNS to propagate. And so we'll come back to this tab after we set up our droplet, and then we'll try to verify the records. So just make sure you have all your records saved, and let's get started with creating our VPS. Next, let's set up our droplet. So make sure to log into your DigitalOcean account, and if you don't have one, use my referral link in the description below for $200 of free credit. That'll get you up and running for free, and it won't cost you anything. Once you have an account, go over to Droplets, and I don't have any right now, so I'll click Create Droplet. In here, we'll have to pick a region, so you can just pick one that's closest to you. After that, we want to select an image for our server, And instead of choosing one of these, I'm going to go to the marketplace, and they have one that already has Docker pre-installed, and it also has Git, and we need both of those tools. So make sure to select this Docker image from the marketplace. Then we need to choose our server specs. So for our CPU, we'll just use a regular and select this $6 a month. This is going to give us 1 GB of RAM and 25 gigs of storage, which is plenty for our test app. Now there are cheaper versions, but since we're running Docker, we need some more memory. And so it will cost us $6 a month. But again, if you have the credit, then it shouldn't cost you anything. We don't need to add any extra volumes, and you'll probably want to enable backups if you're actually running this app and you care about the data that it's storing. But it does come at a little extra cost, so I'm not going to enable it for now because this is just a test app. Now we need to choose our authentication method. Now you could choose a password, but that is not secure or not as secure as an SSH key. And so I'll show you how to get the SSH key set up. I'll create a new key here, and here are some steps on the right for how to generate a new key. So I'm on Mac, and I'm going to copy this command and open up a terminal shell. On my computer, I have all my SSH keys under the root directory and then a .ssh directory. So I'm going to change into that directory and then copy this command up here. So SSH keygen, and that's going to generate a public and private key pair. Now I need to give it a file name that it's going to save to. So I'll just call this MERN Droplet. Then I'll just hit enter for an empty passphrase. And there we go. So our keys have been generated. And if you do an ls command, then you should see those files. So let's clear that and go down here. So the next step is to copy the public key. So let's go back into our folder here and just print out the contents of our file. So we called it MERN Droplet, and then we want the .pub extension, and that's going to print out all of this content here. So this is the public key that goes on to our server. So make sure to paste that in, but the private key is only on my computer. So when I try to SSH into the server, it's going to use this public key and match it against the private key on my computer. And only people with my private key will be able to gain access. So now let's just give this key a name, and I'll just say MERN key, and we'll add it. So make sure it's selected here, and I'll just deselect my other key that I made previously. You can check this box for metrics and monitoring, which comes at no extra cost, so it doesn't hurt. And then you could give it a custom host name. So we'll just say MERN demo. If you want to add some tags, you could, and I only have one project here. So let's create the droplet. So the server is spinning up, and once it's ready, it should give us an IP address. Then we can use that IP address to SSH into the machine and also update our DNS records to point to this server. So our server is up and running, and if you click here, you can get the public IP address for it. Let's go update our DNS records to point our domain to this IP. So I'll go back into Cloudflare and add a new record. This time it's going to be an A record, and I'm going to use the @ symbol for my root domain, and the value is just going to be this IP address. Now, if you're using Cloudflare, you can choose to either proxy it or not. Just keep in mind that if you do want to use the Cloudflare proxy, then you also have to update your SSL settings. So if you go into the overview here, then you'll need to make sure that your SSL/TLS encryption mode is set to full. If it's set to flexible or off, then you'll have issues generating SSL certificates with our Caddy server. If you want, you can just keep the proxy off, just turn it off, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. So let's save this record. And now let's add a record for our API. So it'll also be an A record, and this time the host name will be API. So this will be the full domain. And the value is going to be the same IP because our server is going to handle requests for both the React front end and our API. We have a reverse proxy set up and it'll know how to route each request. So we'll save that. And then lastly, I'm going to add a CNAME for the www version of our domain. So I'll change the type to CNAME. I'll set the name property to www, and it's going to redirect to just the root domain. So I'll just add the @ symbol. So let's give that a save, and it's going to take a few minutes for this to propagate. And in the meantime, let's go back to our server here. Now, when you create a VPS, one of the most important things is security, because you don't want to let other people like hackers or malicious users to gain access to your server and then start reading your data or deleting it and taking down your server. So in order to improve the security of our server, we can add a firewall. And a firewall is just basically going to lock down who can access our server and on what ports. And we can set up all the rules we want. To do that, let's go under the networking tab. And down at the bottom, we can add a firewall. I already have a firewall from before, but I'll create a new one so you guys can follow along. So let's give it a name first, and I'll just say MERN firewall. And now I need to define the inbound rules. So these are the rules for incoming traffic from the internet. So we want to allow traffic on port 22 so that we could SSH into the machine. And I'll keep it as all IPv4 and IPv6 addresses so that I can connect from my machine. But if you want to be more granular, you can add specific IPs. Next, let's allow traffic on port 80. So we'll just say HTTP and the default port 80 from all IPs. And lastly, we want to allow traffic on port 443, which is the HTTPS port. So this will just allow the traffic when someone looks up our domain and Cloudflare sends us to our server, we want to allow that traffic on these ports. Then for our outbound rules, we just want to allow our server to communicate with everything in the outside world. So we can just leave these as the default. Now we need to assign it to a droplet. So let's just look up our droplet. And there it is, MERN demo, and we'll create the firewall. So now we see it's assigned to our droplet, and we could go back to this droplet here. Now that our firewall is set up, we need to actually SSH into the server and run our application. So right now, if someone visits our domain, it's going to route us to our server on this IP. But our server is not going to respond with anything because currently we haven't set up our app or configured Caddy. To do that, let's go back to our terminal and make sure you're in the same directory that you copied the SSH keys in. And you could connect to your server by doing SSH and then pass the -i flag and then the name of the file. In my case, that was MERN Droplet. And then we'll specify the user. So we'll say root @ and then the IP of our server. So I'm going to copy that right here and just paste that in. So then it's going to read the private key that's in the same directory and it should authenticate us. I have to type yes here and there we go. So now we're in our remote server and we're ready to start installing dependencies. So the first thing you always want to do when connecting to your server for the first time is update all the packages. We can do that by just doing apt-get update. So run that command and that'll just update all the dependencies. Once that's done, we should see that Git is installed. So we could do git -- version and we have Git installed and then docker -v and it shows that Docker is also installed. So those are the only tools that we need for our app. The next step is to clone our repository that has our Docker configuration. To do that, let's first create a directory where we're going to clone the repo into. Right now, we're at the root directory, and by convention, you'll see applications cloned into the /var/www folder. And that's just convention, but you can really make it whatever you want. So let's create that folder. We'll call it var, and then we'll change into that folder. Then we'll create a directory www and also change into that. So now we're at the root directory /var/www. And here's a good spot to clone the repository. You can find the repo in the description below. And once you get to it, you want to click this code button and just copy the URL here. Once you have that, you can go back to the terminal and run git clone and then paste in that URL. So now if we do an ls, we should see there's our project. So let's change into there and we should see all of our code here. So we have our front end directory, back end, and some other files. And I'm not on the right branch. So again, make sure that you check out this yt docker prod. To do that, you can run git checkout and then the branch name. And now we should be on that branch. So if I do an ls, here's where we have our Docker Compose file and all the other files we need. So now the next step is to fill out all of our environment variables. So we have one env file at the root of our project here, and it's just going to have the domain name. So I'm going to copy this sample env into a .env file. I could do that by running copy sample.env and then do a space and call .env. And now let's open up the .env file with Vim. And in here, I'm going to type I to go into insert mode and just paste in my custom domain. You'll want to add your custom domain here. And when you're done, hit escape, then :right quit. So that environment variable is set. The next environment file we need is our backend env. So in here, we have a bunch of variables for our JWT secret and our API key and also our database URL. So let's change into the backend directory. And in here, I'm going to run the same copy command. And then let's open up the .env file with Vim. And now let's update these variables. So the node environment is going to be production. The app origin is now going to be our custom domain. This would be your front end URL. For the Mongo URI, this can stay the same because this is just referencing the Mongo service on the Docker network. So that's going to be the same. For our secret, we don't want to use these insecure secrets. So I'm going to generate a new JWT secret just in the terminal here. And there's a handy command that I'm going to run. It's basically just running node and console logging the crypto module, which calls the random bytes method. So I'm just going to paste that in and copy this string. Go back in here and paste that in. Then let's get rid of our refresh secret and generate a new one. I'll run that same command again and copy this new secret. So those are a little more secure. And now let's add our email sender. So this is going to be basically who is sending the emails from our app. So I'll do something like no reply at mydomain.com. Lastly, we need our Resend API key. So let's go back into Resend. And at this point, our DNS should be propagated. So let's click Verify Records. And it looks like they're pending now. And there we go. Now they're verified. So we should be able to send emails from this domain. To actually send the emails, we need an API key. So let's go to API keys and create a new one. I'll just call this prod MERN. And for the permission, we'll only give it sending access for our domain that we just added. So now let's just copy this key and we'll paste it in our environment file here. Once you've added in all these variables, then you'll just want to write and quit. And that should be ready. So we have all of our variables filled out and we're ready to go back out to the root directory. And at this level, you should see a Docker Compose file. And that's this file that you see here with our 4 services. And so the last step that we need to do is run docker compose up. And then make sure you add this -d flag to run it in detach mode. And that's going to allow you to close out of this terminal and it won't shut down all the containers. So once you run that, it should build all your containers. And I just ran this command, so I'll just add the -- build argument, and that'll go and rebuild them. So it looks like they're all running, and it'll probably take longer for yours if it's the first time that you're creating the containers. Once they're up and running, you can do docker ps, and that'll show your containers that are all running. So you could see here are the names of the containers, and you can see they're up for 6 minutes. So now let's actually go in our browser and verify that our app is up. So I'll go on HTTPS, and then I'll type in my custom domain. And here we see our app is running. And if I go to the network tab, we should see our API is also running. So I'll try to log in with a user that doesn't exist. And we see that we make a request to api.mydomain.com, and it's running on HTTPS. Now let's test that our emails are going through. So I'm going to sign up for a new account. Then I'll add my password, and we'll hit create account. So that looks like it went through. Now I'm going to go check my email, and you see that I just got a new message. Here's that email that was sent, and it's coming from noreply@mydomain.com. Now let's try to verify our email, and we see that all went through. So it looks like our app is working just as it did before, and it's all running on the cloud with a custom domain hooked up to it. Now you might be wondering how you can deploy new code when you want to add a new feature or fix a bug. So let's change this title to something different. I'm just going to add some exclamation marks, and we're going to have to save our file. And on this branch, I'm going to push that change. So I'll just say testing deployment. And once that's pushed to our remote repository, we can go back into our terminal here and make sure you're in the same directory as the Git repo, and you'll want to pull down those new changes. So you'll see we have that file change. And now, in order for that change to get reflected, we have to tear down our Docker containers and rebuild them. And unfortunately, that's going to mean some downtime for our users. And that's kind of the thing that's not ideal about this setup. So to get around that, you'd have to use Docker Swarm or Kubernetes, and that's just out of scope for this video. But for your side project that has 0 users, this is a totally valid way to run your app. So to tear down the current stack, you can do docker compose down, and that's going to stop all your containers. So now if someone tries to visit your site, then it will just kind of hang there. After you've pulled all the changes, then you'll want to run docker compose up and specify this build flag so that it'll rebuild with your new files that were changed. Let's just run that again, and it'll rebuild our containers. Looks like our containers are back up, and you see our request timed out, but now when we refresh, it's back up and running with our changes. So that's kind of the process, is just tear down the containers, do a git pull, and just rebuild them. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already. It would help me out a ton. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or what you want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one.